Chapter 1. The heavy oak doors of First National Bank swung open with a creak, and an old, ragged man shuffled inside. His clothes were worn, his face lined with deep wrinkles, and a dusty sack hung over his hunched shoulders. The polished marble floors and gleaming chandeliers of the bank made him look even more out of place. Customers glanced up, some smirking, others quickly looking away. The tellers exchanged amused glances. Just another confused old man, they thought. Then he spoke. "This bank is mine." Silence. Then laughter erupted. A young teller covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. The security guard, a broad-shouldered man named Carl, folded his arms and smirked. Even the bank manager, Mr. Harold Bennett, chuckled as he adjusted his tie. "Sir," Bennett said, his voice dripping with polite amusement, "perhaps you're mistaken. This bank has been here for over a century. It belongs to the Bennett family." The old man didn't flinch. His tired eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Bennett's. "Number, it belongs to me." More laughter. Carl stepped forward, ready to escort him out. But then, the old man dropped the sack. It hit the floor with a thud. So heavy the laughter died instantly. The sound echoed through the grand hall, freezing everyone in place. Slowly, the old man bent down, his gnarled fingers pulling open the sack, and what spilled out made every smile vanish. Bundles of old banknotes, yellowed with age, tied with faded ribbons, stamped with the bank's original and logo, one that hadn't been used in 60 years. A leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle and brown, tumbled out next, and beneath it all, legal documents. Their ink faded, but their seals unmistakable. Bennett's face paled, his fingers trembled as he reached for one of the papers. "What is this?" The old man straightened, his voice quiet but unshakable. "Proof." The room held its breath, because if those papers were real, then everything they knew about First National Bank was a kailin. Before we continue, did that send chills down your spine? This is just the beginning of a story filled with shocking twists, hidden truths, and a battle for justice that's been buried for decades. If you're hooked, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us what you think happens next. Your support helps us bring more incredible stories to life. Thank you. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The small town of Millfield was the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened. Nestled between rolling hills, its quiet streets were lined with old brick buildings, and the First National Bank stood proudly at the center of town. For generations, the Bennett family had run it, their name engraved on every plaque, every document. But no one remembered him. No one remembered Elias Grayson. 50 years ago, Elias had been a young, ambitious man. He'd built this bank from the ground up, pouring his sweat, his dreams, and every penny he had into its foundation. His partner, Thomas Bennett, had been his closest friend until greed twisted that friendship into betrayal. One night, Elias arrived at the bank to find the locks changed. The papers had been altered. His name had been erased. Thomas Bennett stood in Hamizma's office, smiling as he said, "It's mine now." Elias fought. He took the Bennetts to court, but the judges were paid off. The lawyers turned against him, and when he refused to back down, they made him disappear. For decades, the town forgot Elias Grayson. They thought he died penniless, a broken man. But he hadn't. He'd been waiting, gathering proof, biding his time, and now, at last, he was back. Inside the bank, Harold Bennett's hands shook as he flipped through the ledger. The dates matched, the signatures matched, even the ink matched the framed certificates hanging on the wall behind him, the ones that bore his family's name. His throat tightened. This can't be real." Elias's voice was steel. "It is." Carl, the security guard, shifted uneasily. "Boss, should I call the police?" Harold didn't answer. His mind raced. If these documents were genuine, then his family's fortune, their legacy, everything was built on a crime. And the man they'd all laughed at moments ago, he was the true owner of First National Bank. The air in First National Bank was so thick with tension you could slice it with a knife. Harold Bennett's fingers trembled as he held the ancient ledger, its yellowed pages whispering secrets from half a century ago. His eyes darted across the entries, dates, transactions, signatures, all in faded ink but unmistakably real. Elias Grayson stood silent, watching. Around them, the bank's employees and customers had gone completely still. The young teller who had laughed earlier now clutched the counter, her knuckles white. Carl, the security guard, kept glancing at Harold, waiting for orders. But Harold was frozen, his mind racing. This can't be happening. He flipped another page, and there it was. A signature. Not his grandfather's. Elias Grayson's. Harold's breath hitched. His family had always said Elias was a liar, a con man who had tried to steal the bank. But this ledger, this proof, told a different story. Elias finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "You recognize it, don't you?" Harold's jaw tightened. He wanted to deny it, to call Elias a fraud, to have Carl throw him out. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down he had always suspected. Flashback. The betrayal Millfield, 1955. The bank was new then, its doors freshly painted, its vault gleaming. Elias Grayson and Thomas Bennett stood side by side, grinning as they cut the ribbon. Business partners, best friends. But Thomas had always wanted more. One evening, as Elias worked late, Thomas slipped into the records room. With careful hands, he altered documents, forged signatures, and made sure that when the time came, the bank would be his, and his alone. When Elias discovered the theft, he stormed into Thomas's office, fury in his eyes. "You snake!" Elias had roared. "I built this place with my own hands." Thomas merely smiled. "Prove it." And when Elias tried, the courts turned against him, the town turned against him, and one night, as Elias walked home, shadowy figures dragged him into an alley, whispering a warning, "Leave Millfield, or disappear forever." Present day, the truth unfolds. Back in the bank, Harold finally looked up from the ledger, his face pale. "These could be forgeries," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Elias reached into his sack again. This time he pulled out a small rusted key. "You know what this is?" Harold's breath caught. Every Bennett knew the legend of the Grayson Vault, a secret compartment built into the original bank, rumored to hold documents too damning to see the light of day. But no one had ever found it. Until now. Elias's eyes burned with decades of quiet fury. "Open it," he said, "unless you're afraid of what we'll find." The crowd gasped. Harold's hands shook. Because if that vault existed, everything the Bennetts owned was built on a lie. The silence in the bank was suffocating. All eyes were locked on the rusted key in Elias Grayson's hand. A small, unassuming thing, yet it carried the weight of decades of buried lies. Harold Bennett stared at it like it was a venomous snake, his mind racing. He had heard the stories, of course. The Grayson Vault was family legend, something his grandfather had mentioned in hushed tones, always dismissing it as nonsense. But now, standing in front of the man who had been erased from history, Harold couldn't dismiss anything anymore. Elias didn't wait for permission. He turned and walked toward the back of the bank, his steps slow but deliberate, the sack still slung over his shoulder. The crowd parted for him, some out of curiosity, others out of fear. Harold hesitated, then followed, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He had to see this through. If this was some kind of trick, he needed to expose it. And if it wasn't, well, he wasn't ready to face that possibility yet. The employees whispered among themselves as Elias stopped in front of the oldest section of the bank, a part of the building that had remained unchanged since its founding. The walls were lined with vintage safety deposit boxes, their brass fittings dull with age. Elias ran his fingers along the wood paneling until he found what he was looking for. a nearly invisible seam in the wall, hidden in the ornate carvings. He pressed his palm against it, and with a soft click, a small compartment slid open. Harold's breath caught in his throat. Inside was a keyhole. Elias didn't hesitate. He inserted the rusted key and turned it. The sound of grinding gears echoed through the bank, and then, with a deep, resonant groan, a section of the wall shifted, revealing a hidden door. The crowd gasped. Even Carl, the security guard, took a step back, his hand instinctively going to his holster. Elias turned to Harold, his expression unreadable. "After you," he said quietly. Harold swallowed hard. His legs felt like lead, but he forced himself forward. The air inside the hidden vault was stale, thick with the scent of old paper and dust. The space was small, just enough room for a single desk and a safe embedded in the wall. But it was what sat on that desk that made Harold's blood run cold. A ledger, identical to the one Elias had brought with him, lay open. Next to it was a stack of documents, their edges brittle with age, and on top of them all, a faded photograph. Harold picked it up with trembling hands. The image showed two young men standing in front of the newly built bank, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like brothers. One was unmistakably Elias Grayson. The other was Thomas Bennett, Harold's grandfather. But it was the inscription at the bottom that made Harold's stomach twist. "To my dearest friend and partner Thomas, may this bank stand as a testament to our trust. Elias Grayson, 1955. Harold's hands shook. His grandfather had always claimed Elias was a thief, a liar, a man who had tried to steal what wasn't his. But this was proof of something else entirely. Elias stepped into the vault, his eyes scanning the contents with a mix of sorrow and grim satisfaction. "He told you I betrayed him, didn't he?" Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it was the other way around." Harold couldn't speak. His mind was reeling, the foundation of everything he had ever believed crumbling beneath him. He reached for the documents, flipping through them with increasing dread. Deeds, contracts, all signed by Elias Grayson, all bearing the official stamps of Millfield's old courthouse. And then he saw it, a single sheet of paper, its contents so damning Harold nearly dropped it. It was a confession, written in his grandfather's own hand. "I, Thomas Bennett, admit to the forgery of documents and the theft of First National Bank from its rightful owner, Elias Grayson. I acted out of greed, and for that I bear the guilt. But the law will never side with him, for I have made sure of it." The date at the bottom was just 2 weeks before Elias had supposedly disappeared. Harold's vision blurred. His grandfather, the man he had idolized, the man whose legacy he had spent his life upholding, was a fraud, a thief. Worse, he had tried to erase Elias completely, ensuring no one would ever question the Bennett family's ownership. Elias watched him, his expression unreadable. "Now you know," he said softly. The weight of those words crashed over Harold like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about the bank. This was about justice, about a man who had spent his entire life fighting to reclaim what was stolen from him. And now, after 50 years, Elias Grayson was finally standing in the heart of his own bank, staring into the eyes of the man who had benefited from his ruin. Outside the vault, the crowd had grown restless. Murmurs turned into shouts as people demanded to know what was happening. A reporter who had been in the bank to deposit a check was already on the phone, his voice rising in excitement. Harold knew this story would spread like wildfire. The Bennett's reputation, their power, their very name, all of it was about to burn. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Elias stepped forward, his gaze steady. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I just want what's mine." Harold closed his eyes. The choice before him was impossible. Fight this in court, drag Elias through another legal battle, and risk exposing even more of his family's sins? Or surrender the bank, admit the truth, and let history finally be set right? When he opened his eyes again, Elias was still watching him, waiting. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of the past. Then, from the crowd, a voice rang out, clear and sharp. "Call the police!" Harold turned. Standing at the front of the onlookers was his younger brother, Daniel Bennett, his face twisted in fury. "This is a setup," Daniel snarled. "That old man is a con artist, and I won't let him steal our family's legacy." Elias didn't flinch. He simply reached into his sack one last time and pulled out a final document, a will. "Read it," he said, handing it to Harold. Harold's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. It was his grandfather's last will and testament, and in it, Thomas Bennett had left one final instruction. If Elias Grayson ever returns, give him back what is rightfully his. The room erupted into chaos. The moment Harold read those final words, the world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. His grandfather's will, hidden, suppressed, never filed with the courts, had just shattered the Bennett family's last defense. Around him, the bank erupted into noise. Reporters snapped photos, customers whispered in shock. Daniel, his face red with fury, lunged forward like he wanted to rip the document from Harold's hands. Elias stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on Harold. There was no gloating in his gaze, no triumph, just the quiet exhaustion of a man who had waited too long for justice. Daniel grabbed Harold's arm, his fingers digging in. "This is fake," he hissed. "Grandfather would never—" "It's his handwriting," Harold interrupted, his voice hollow. He knew every curve of his grandfather's script, every flourish of his signature. There was no denying it. Daniel's grip tightened. Then he was coerced. That old liar probably threatened him. Elias didn't react to the insult. He simply reached into his sack again and pulled out one last item, a small, worn journal. He held it out to Harold. "Read for yourself," he said. Harold took it with numb fingers. The journal was his grandfather's private diary, filled with entries spanning decades. He flipped to a page near the end, his eyes scanning the cramped, frantic writing. "I can't sleep. The guilt is eating me alive. Every time I close my eyes, I see Elias's face. I thought wealth would make the betrayal worth it, but all it's given me is nightmares. I should have never listened to Father. I should have never—" The entry ended abruptly, as if Thomas had been too ashamed to finish. Harold's hand shook. His grandfather, the stern patriarch who had taught him to value the Bennett name above all else, had died, drowning in regret. Daniel snatched the journal, his eyes darting across the page. His face twisted, first in disbelief, then in rage. "So what?" he spat, throwing the journal to the ground. "A few scribbled words don't change anything. The bank is ours by law." Elias finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "The law was bought, the deeds were forged, but the truth doesn't disappear just because powerful men bury it." The crowd murmured. A few people nodded. Others looked uneasy, their loyalties shifting like sand. Harold felt sick. He had spent his life upholding the Bennett legacy, believing in the righteousness of his family's wealth. Now he stood in the wreckage of that illusion. Daniel wasn't done. He turned to the crowd, his voice booming. "This man is a fraud. He's trying to steal what our family built. Are you really going to let some senile old man rewrite history?" For a moment, the crowd wavered. The Bennetts had ruled Millfield for generations. Their name was on the library, the hospital, the town hall. People owed them favors, jobs, livelihoods. Then a voice cut through the tension. "I remember Elias Grayson." Everyone turned. An elderly woman, her back hunched with age, stepped forward. Mrs. Wilkins, the town's oldest resident. Her gnarled finger pointed at Elias. "You built this bank. You gave my father a loan when no one else would. The Bennetts called you a thief, but we knew the truth." Silence. Then another voice. "My grandfather worked for Mr. Grayson, said he was the fairest man in town." And another. "The Bennetts fired my dad when he questioned where the money really came from." The dam broke. Stories spilled out, whispers of corruption, of forced silence, of a town that had been afraid to speak for 50 years. Daniel's face turned purple. "Lies! All of it!" He whirled on Harold. "Are you really going to let this happen? After everything our family sacrificed?" Harold looked at his brother, then at Elias, then at the will in his hands. The weight of the decision crushed him. But in the end, there was only one choice. He took a deep breath and turned to the crowd. First National Bank, he said, his voice barely steady, belongs to Elias Grayson. The room exploded. Daniel screamed in fury. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. The bank employees stood frozen, unsure who to follow now. Elias didn't move. He just watched Harold, his eyes unreadable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his sack one final time and pulled out a gun. Gasps filled the room. Carl, the security guard, lunged forward, but Elias didn't raise the weapon. Instead, he placed it gently on the desk. "This was your grandfather's," he said to Harold. "The night he had me dragged out of town, he pressed it into my hands and told me to protect myself. Said it was the only apology he could give." Harold stared at the gun, his throat tight. Elias's next words were barely audible. "I never used it, but I kept it to remind myself that even the worst men can have moments of conscience." The room fell utterly silent. Then, from the back of the crowd, a single pair of hands began to clap. Slowly, others joined. The sound built, a wave of approval, of vindication, of justice delayed but not denied. Daniel looked around at the faces of his neighbors, his customers, his town, and saw only condemnation. With a snarl, he turned and stormed out, shoving people aside. The door slammed behind him. Harold didn't follow. He just stood there, staring at the gun, the will, the journal, the wreckage of his family's lies. Elias finally stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. But Harold knew better. For the Bennetts, it was only the beginning of the end. The applause died down, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. Elias Grayson stood motionless at the center of the bank, his shoulders squared but his face weary. The gun still lay on the desk between him and Harold, a silent testament to decades of buried guilt and stolen legacies. Harold couldn't tear his eyes away from it, his grandfather's final, twisted act of remorse. Around them, the crowd hesitated. Some customers edged toward the door, unsure if they should stay. The bank employees exchanged nervous glances. Were they now working for Elias Grayson? The air smelled of sweat and old paper, thick with the weight of what had just been uncovered. Elias was the first to move. He picked up the gun carefully, turned it over in his hands, then slid it back into his sack. When he spoke, his voice was rough but clear. "I don't want a spectacle," he said. "Just what's mine." Harold swallowed hard. His mind raced through the legal implications, the deeds, the lawsuits, the press storm that would follow. But one thing was certain. The bank belonged to Elias now, and Harold had no fight left in him. "What happens next?" Harold asked quietly. Elias studied him for a long moment. "You tell me. You know this place better than I do now." The unexpected offer hung in the air. Harold blinked. "You're keeping me on?" "If you want to stay," Elias said, "a man shouldn't pay for his grandfather's sins." The words hit Harold like a punch to the chest. After everything, after the lies, the theft, the betrayal, Elias was offering him mercy. Before Harold could respond, a loud crash echoed from the back of the bank. Everyone turned. Daniel stood in the doorway of the vault, his face twisted in rage. In his hands was the old ledger, the one that proved everything. "You think it's this easy?" Daniel snarled. With a violent motion, he ripped a page from the ledger and held it aloft. "No court will believe a word of this without proof." Elias didn't flinch. "There are copies." Daniel's grin turned vicious. "Not of this." And with that, he struck a match. Gasps filled the room as the flame touched the paper. The edges blackened, curling inward as the fire consumed Thomas Bennett's confession. Harold lunged forward, but it was too late. The page crumbled to ash in Daniel's hand. "Now it's your word against ours," Daniel spat. "And who do you think this town will believe? A forgotten old man? Or the Bennetts?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. He was right. Without concrete proof, Elias's claim would be a messy legal battle, one that could drag on for years. Elias sighed, as if he'd expected this. Then he reached into his sack one last time. "Good thing I made more than one copy," he said, pulling out a thick stack of papers, each one identical to the burned page. Daniel's face went white. Elias turned to Harold. "Your choice now. Stand with him, or help me rebuild what your family broke." The silence stretched. Then, slowly, Harold stepped forward, not toward Daniel, but toward Elias. Daniel let out a furious scream and charged, but Carl, the security guard, caught him mid-lunge. "I think it's time you left," Carl growled, dragging Daniel toward the door. As the chaos settled, Elias turned back to the bank's counter. He ran a hand over the polished wood, his fingers tracing the grooves of decades. "First order of business," he said louder now. "Anyone who's ever been wronged by the Bennetts, come see me. We're starting fresh." A stunned murmur rippled through the room. Then, hesitantly, a line began to form. Harold watched, his chest tight. The bank was Elias's now, but the fight for Millfield's soul had only just begun. The match's flame flickered out as the last remnants of the burned page drifted to the marble floor. Daniel stood panting, his eyes wild with triumph, until Elias produced the duplicate documents. The color drained from his face as the crowd's murmurs turned against him. Harold felt the weight of decision pressing down. His brother's furious gaze burned into him, but when he spoke, his voice didn't waver. "It's over, Daniel." Carl's grip tightened on Daniel's arm as he dragged him toward the exit. "You're making a mistake!" Daniel screamed, his voice cracking. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, cutting off his threats. Elias exhaled slowly, the lines on his face deepening. He turned to the gathered crowd. Bank employees, customers, townspeople who remembered the truth. "First National Bank opens under new management tomorrow," he announced. "Every account will be honored, every debt reviewed." A nervous teller raised her hand. "Our jobs—" Elias's expression softened. "If you want to stay, your positions are secure." His eyes met Harold's. "All of you." The tension in the room eased slightly. Harold watched as townspeople began approaching Elias, some with curiosity, others with hesitant gratitude. Mrs. Wilkins from the diner pressed his hand between her wrinkled palms. "Welcome home, Mr. Grayson." Harold moved to the vault, needing air. The hidden compartment still stood open, its secrets exposed. He ran his fingers over his grandfather's journal, the admission of guilt staring back at him in faded ink. A shadow fell across the page. Elias stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the bank's electric lights. "He wasn't all bad, your grandfather," Elias said quietly. "Just weak when it mattered most." Harold swallowed hard. "Why offer me a place here? After everything?" Elias studied the vault's contents. "Because hatred is a heavy thing to carry for 50 years. He met Harold's eyes. "And this town needs bankers who understand redemption." The morning sun streamed through the bank's tall windows as Harold adjusted his tie behind the newly polished manager's desk. It felt strange sitting here now, knowing every document in the drawers, every plaque on the wall, had been bought with stolen money. Across from him, Elias sorted through stacks of old files, his gnarled fingers carefully separating decades of forged records from legitimate ones. The quiet scratching of his pen was the only sound in the office until the front door burst open. A dozen people crowded the lobby, their faces a mix of hope and skepticism. At the front stood old Mr. Peterson, gripping a yellowed loan agreement and shaking hands. "They foreclosed on my farm in '72, he said, sliding the paper across the counter. "Said I missed payments I know I made." Elias didn't even check the records. He reached for the checkbook. What was the farm worth? The room erupted. More documents appeared, deeds with altered dates, loan papers with forged signatures, insurance claims that had mysteriously vanished. Harold watched in stunned silence as Elias methodically worked through each case, his jaw set in grim determination. By noon, the line stretched out the door and down the block. Across town, Daniel Bennett slammed his fist on the oak desk of his lawyer's office. There must be something we can do. The attorney sighed, pushing his glasses up his nose. Without challenging the will's authenticity, your options are limited. Unless ... He paused meaningfully. Daniel's eyes darkened with understanding. Back at the bank, Harold noticed the first warning sign when the elderly Mrs. Henderson's withdrawal request came through. 500,000? He frowned at the slip. Your account shows a balance of... I know what it shows, she snapped, her beady eyes darting toward Elias. I want my money. Now. As Harold processed the transaction, he caught two more unusually large withdrawal requests in quick succession. His stomach tightened. This wasn't coincidence. It was a run on the bank. Elias looked up from his work, sensing the shift in the room. The whispers had started, subtle at first, then growing louder. What if he can't cover it? Someone murmured near the water cooler. My cousin says the Bennetts already moved their accounts. The panic spread, like spilled ink. Harold watched helplessly as the line of customers morphed from those seeking justice to those gripped by fear. He reached for the intercom just as the front doors flew open again. Reporters swarmed in, cameras flashing. At their center stood Daniel, his smile all practiced concern. I'm only here to protect our town's financial interests, he announced to the room. While Mr. Grayson's story is compelling, banking requires more than sentimental history. Elias rose slowly, his hands braced against the desk. Harold saw the pain in the movement, the toll the day had taken. But when the old man spoke, his voice carried through the chaos. Every penny will be honored. He locked eyes with Daniel. Unlike your family, I don't steal. The challenge hung in the air. Daniel's smile didn't waver, but Harold saw his fingers twitch. Then prove it, he said smoothly, producing a withdrawal slip of his own. 3 million. Cash. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Harold's blood ran cold. That was nearly all their liquid reserves. Elias didn't blink. He took the slip and scrawled his signature. Harold, he said quietly, bring up the vault. As they descended the narrow stairs, Harold grabbed Elias's arm. We don't have that much on hand. The transfers from... I know. Elias's face was grim in the vault's dim light. He moved to the back wall, running his fingers along the bricks until one shifted beneath his touch. With a sharp tug, he pulled it free, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay stacks of bound $100 bills, their paper crisp despite the years. Harold's breath caught. Is this... Your grandfather's insurance policy? Elias's mouth twisted. Stolen money, kept safe all these years. Waiting. They counted it quickly. Just over 3 million, preserved like a time capsule of guilt. Harold's hands shook as he loaded the cash into bags. Daniel knew, he realized aloud. He knew about this money. Elias nodded grimly. Now we see if his greed outweighs his pride. Back upstairs, the crowd had grown restless. Daniel's smug expression faltered when Harold dumped the heavy bags on the counter with a thud. Your withdrawal, Mr. Bennett. For one tense moment, no one moved. Then Daniel reached for the bags, his fingers lingering just a second too long on the aged bills. The reporters surged forward, cameras capturing every detail. The dates on the bills, the shocked recognition in Daniel's eyes, the quiet triumph in Elias's stance. Daniel recovered quickly, hefting the bags with a forced laugh. I'll be depositing this in a more stable institution. He turned to leave, but not before Harold caught the unease in his eyes. As the door closed behind him, the mood in the bank shifted again. The remaining customers exchanged glances. Slowly, one by one, they returned their withdrawal slips to their pockets. Elias sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 80 years. Harold expected satisfaction, even relief. Instead, the old man's face was etched with sorrow. He recognized those serial numbers, he murmured. After all this time, he knew. Outside, the reporters were already broadcasting live, their excited voices carrying through the glass. Across town, safe deposit boxes would be opening, long-hidden secrets spilling into the light. The reckoning Harold had feared was here, but as he watched Elias stare at the hidden vault's brick now sitting on the desk between them, Harold understood the deeper truth. Some debts could never be repaid with money. The bank's doors stayed open late that night as the real work began. The bank had been closed for hours, but the lights still burned bright inside. Harold sat cross-legged on the vault floor, surrounded by stacks of safety deposit boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. His fingers trembled as he inserted the master key into the first one, box number 117, belonging to a J. McCullough. The lock clicked with a sound like a gun cocking. Inside lay a single envelope, yellowed with age. Harold peeled it open carefully. The letter inside was dated 1963, the handwriting achingly familiar, his grandfather's. Payment received for services rendered regarding the Grayson matter. As discussed, no further contact will be necessary. Beneath it sat a faded photograph of a young Elias Grayson being led away in handcuffs, his face bloodied. Harold's stomach turned. He'd known his family's sins ran deep, but seeing proof of their involvement in Elias's arrest, fabricated charges no doubt, made his throat tighten. Across the room, Elias sorted through another box, his movements slow but deliberate. He hadn't spoken since they'd found the hidden money. The weight of the day pressed down on both of them, heavier than the stacks of cash they'd hauled upstairs. Harold reached for box number 203. The nameplate read T. Bennett, his grandfather's personal box. The contents were sparse: a cigar box, a stack of bonds, and a small leather journal Harold had never seen before. He flipped it open, his pulse quickening. The entries were erratic, jumping between dates, the ink smudged in places as if by shaking hands. Elias knows. He'll go to the authorities, have to stop him before... The next page was torn out. Then, later, done what needed doing. Father says the Grayson name will be forgotten within a year, but the dreams won't stop. I see him in the alley, begging me to... Another tear. Harold's hands shook. He'd spent his life idolizing his grandfather, believing in the Bennett legacy. Now, all he saw was a coward who'd ruined lives and then drowned in guilt. A soft thud made him look up. Elias stood over him, holding a rusted lockbox. His face was ashen. "Yours?" Harold asked. Elias shook his head. "John McCullough's, the judge who sentenced me." The lockbox opened with a screech of metal. Inside lay a stack of cash and a note. "For ensuring Grayson's conviction, as agreed." Harold exhaled sharply. They paid him off. Elias didn't react. His fingers traced the edges of the bills, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he flipped the box over, dumping its contents onto the floor. Something clattered against the tile, a key. Harold picked it up. It was smaller than a safety deposit key, its teeth oddly shaped. "What does this open?" Elias studied it, then stiffened. "The courthouse basement. They kept evidence there." His voice was rough. "Including mine." A chill ran down Harold's spine. If they could prove Elias's arrest had been fabricated, it would dismantle the last shred of the Bennett's credibility. But it would also force the town to confront its own complicity. Outside, a car door slammed. Harold tensed, scrambling to his feet. Through the bank's front windows, he saw flashlights cutting through the dark. Daniel hadn't waited for morning. Elias moved first, shoving the most damning documents into his sack. Back door. Harold grabbed his grandfather's journal, hesitating only a second before taking the cash too. If this was their only chance to prove the truth, they'd need resources. The rear exit led to a narrow alley. Harold turned toward the street, but Elias caught his arm. "Not that way." He nodded toward the storm drain at their feet. "They'll be watching the roads." Harold stared at him. "You want to go underground?" Elias's smile was grim. "I've done it before." As they pried up the grate, the bank's front windows shattered behind them. Harold didn't look back. He lowered himself into the darkness, the journal pressed tight against his chest. The tunnels were damp and reeked of mildew, their walls slick with condensation. Elias led the way without hesitation, his steps sure despite the gloom. Harold followed, his mind racing. They weren't just running from Daniel. They were running toward a truth that could burn Millfield to the ground. The courthouse basement smelled of damp concrete and old secrets. Harold's shoes slipped on the moss-slick steps as he followed Elias deeper into the darkness, the stolen key burning a hole in his pocket. Behind them, distant shouts echoed through the storm drains. Daniel's men were still searching, but they'd taken a wrong turn 2 tunnels back. Elias stopped abruptly at a rusted door marked, "Evidence, authorized personnel only." The key slid in with a grinding click. The room beyond was a graveyard of Millfield's sins. Dust-covered shelves stretched into the shadows, stacked with boxes labeled by year and case number. Elias moved straight to the back, his hand steady as he pulled down a crate stamped 1959-State versus Grayson. Inside lay Elias's past in fragments, a faded mugshot showing his bruised face, a counterfeit bill allegedly found in his possession, and, most damning, a signed confession. Harold picked it up, his stomach churning. "This isn't your handwriting." Elias's laugh was hollow. Number, but it convinced the jury. He dug deeper, uncovering a smaller envelope. When he tore it open, yellowed newspaper clippings fluttered to the floor, headlines proclaiming local banker arrested for forgery and Bennett Bank secures landmark deal. Beneath them all lay a single photograph. Harold's breath caught. It showed his grandfather shaking hands with Judge McCullough outside the courthouse, both men smiling. The date scrawled on the back was the day after Elias's sentencing. A floorboard creaked overhead. They froze. Heavy footsteps crossed the ceiling, then stopped directly above them. Elias's eyes locked onto Harold's. Without a word, he shoved the evidence into his sack and killed the flashlight. Darkness swallowed them whole. The basement door groaned open. A beam of light sliced through the black, sweeping across shelves. "Check the back," Daniel's voice ordered. Harold pressed himself against the wall, his pulse roaring in his ears. The footsteps grew closer. Then, ring. A cell phone shattered the silence. "What?" Daniel snapped. A pause. "You're sure?" His voice tightened. "Then burn it. All of it." The footsteps retreated. The door slammed. Harold didn't move until Elias exhaled shakily beside him. "They're destroying the bank records," the old man whispered. The truth hit Harold like a punch. Daniel wasn't just covering up the past. He was erasing it. They emerged into a storm. Rain sheeted down as they sprinted toward First National, but the glow on the horizon wasn't lightning. Flames licked the bank's upper windows. Elias lunged forward, but Harold yanked him back as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Sirens wailed in the distance. Across the street, Daniel stood watching, his face illuminated by the fire. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Then Daniel turned and walked away. Elias sank to his knees in the mud, the sack of evidence clutched to his chest. 50 years of fighting, and now the proof was burning before their eyes. Harold pulled out his phone and dialed 911, then stopped. His thumb hovered over send as he stared at the inferno. The past was burning. But the truth? The truth was in his other hand. His grandfather's journal, the photograph, the key, all the evidence they'd salvaged. He lowered the phone. Elias looked up, rainwater streaming down his face. What now? Harold tightened his grip on the journal. Now they'd do what his family should have done decades ago. "Now," he said, helping Elias to his feet, "we make our last deposit." The Millfield Chronicle office was dark, but Harold pounded on the door until the editor answered, bleary-eyed. When he saw what they carried, his sleepiness vanished. By morning, the town would know everything. As the first presses roared to life, Elias finally let himself cry. Epilogue. The scandal broke at dawn. By noon, protesters surrounded the Bennett estate. By nightfall, Daniel was in custody, not for the fire, but for the fraud the evidence exposed. First National Bank never reopened, But on its ashes, a new building rose, smaller, humbler. The sign above the door read simply, Grayson and Sons. Harold still works there, balancing ledgers in the back office while Elias greets customers up front. Some days, when the light hits just right, you can see them through the window, heads bent together over some old document, still uncovering truths, still making amends. And if you listen closely when the vault door opens, you might hear the faintest echo of laughter, not mocking, not cruel, but light. Finally, after all these years, free.